Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Katy Peace. I'm the Director of Communications for the Preservation League of New York State. Today's program is America Redux, an author talk with Ariel Aberg-Riger. If you have made your way to this webinar but are not familiar with the Preservation League, we are New York's statewide nonprofit focused on investing in people and projects that champion the essential role of preservation in community revitalization, sustainable economic growth, and the protection of our historic buildings and landscapes. We do this work in every corner of New York State in many different ways, including offering technical services, providing grants, our 7 to Save list of endangered historic sites, our Excellence in Historic Preservation Awards, which we are currently accepting nominations for. So go to our website and look out for that if you know of some great people, projects, or organizations doing preservation work. We do public policy and advocacy at the local, state, and federal levels, and we have a whole slate of online programs like this one. And so today we are going to hear from Ariel Aberg-Riger. She's a self-taught artist whose work has been featured in gallery shows, magazines, newspapers, apps, plates, and even a hit card game. She's focused on using the power of visual storytelling to explore issues of equity and social justice, encouraging readers to think differently about history, science, policy, and the other forces that shape our lives. She lives with her wife and kids in Buffalo, New York, and she's a 2020 NYSCA-NYFA Artist Fellow in Nonfiction Literature, a member of the Tin House 2020 Summer Workshop, and she's represented by Jenny Stevens at Sterling Lord Literaristic Inc. And today she's going to be talking about her very recently published book, America Redux, Visual Stories from Our Dynamic History. America Redux explores the themes that create our shared sense of American identity and interrogates the myths we've been telling ourselves for centuries. With iconic American catchphrases as chapter titles, these 21 visual stories illuminate the astonishing, unexpected, sometimes darker sides of history that reverberate in our society to this very day, from the role of celebrity in immigration policy, to the influence of one small group of white women on education, to the effects of progress on housing and the environment, to the inspiring force of collective action and mutual aid across decades and among diverse groups, fully illustrated with collaged archival photographs, maps, documents, graphic elements, and handwritten text. This book is a dazzling, immersive experience that jumps around in time and will make you view history in a whole different light. And really, I loved the book so much, I cannot recommend it enough. So if you haven't already picked it up, please do yourself a favor and get this book. Couple notes about housekeeping before I hand it over to Ariel. Yes, this webinar is being recorded. You will be able to find it along with all of our other virtual programs on our YouTube channel. I will also drop that link in the chat. Captions are enabled for today's webinar, so if you need or want captions, you can enable that through your Zoom taskbar. If you have questions for Ariel during her presentation or after, please drop it in the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring the chat for general comments. Like I said, I'll drop links there. But if you have a question, please do drop it in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many of those as possible in the Q&A following Ariel's presentation. And follow Preservation Book Club on Instagram. We just launched an Instagram page to give some more book recommendations to folks. So follow us there if you are interested in that sort of thing. And the last little bit of news is that CE credits are available. So if you are an architect and would like to take advantage of the continuing education credits through the New York State Education Department, please do either DM me in the chat or send an email. Let me know your name, your firm, phone number, email address, and if you're sending an email, specify which program you have attended. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Ariel.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here with all of you. I can't actually see any of you, but I know that you're there. I am going to share my screen. I have a little presentation to walk through. I'm assuming everyone can see this. Katie, I let you scream at me if for some reason someone says they can't. Okay, perfect. Awesome. So as you already know, I am Ariel. Hello, I am Ariel. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. And I am a visual storyteller. So I love visual storytelling for many reasons, of which I will give you a few tastes tonight. But one of the biggest reasons I love it is because it is such a wide, boundless, kind of undefined zone of making. So I think that when I say visual storytelling, sometimes people picture photography, sometimes they picture film, sometimes they think graphic novels. And for me, visual storytelling just means that I use a combination of words and images to tell stories. I often work in collage. I often tell true stories, nonfiction stories, but I do kind of dabble in everything. And the stories, the types of words I use and the types of imagery I use and the types of styles I use are all dependent on the stories that I'm trying to tell. I've written a ton of different articles, mainly online for places like Teen Vogue and City Lab and The Guardian. I've followed kind of interests that I have from, for example, the prevalence and rise of crows in urban America, they're coming to get us, to the history of mutual aid among marginalized groups in this country, to the legacy of the American Public Library. I also do print visual stories sometimes. So you can see that every kind of visual story shifts and changes depending on the format that it's in. This is a piece about ChatGPT that's in the current issue of the MIT Technology Review, which I, of course, had to compare to 18th century automata because I'm me. And I also do a lot of visual storytelling on social platforms like Instagram, where I talk about local government a lot and kind of break down the way cities work for people so they can become more involved with their cities and the people who represent them. I've also spent the past few years writing a book, which is why I'm here talking to you tonight. So we don't have so much time tonight, so I'll kind of go through things quickly, but tonight I'm going to read you an excerpt from the book. Then I thought we could go behind the scenes to kind of give you a brief little glimpse into what my kind of process of creating a spread, so how I balance more traditional kind of research and writing processes with the visual side. And then we'll open it up to a discussion and a Q&A, and you can help guide us however you like, and we can follow your interests to talk more about the book. So a look inside the book. So America Redux, as Katie said, is a book about US history, but it's not a normal history book in any way. It's fully visual, and it's made up of 21 different stories from our history that go from the 1500s to the present, and it's completely not chronological at all. So it's kind of driven thematically, and the whole book weaves in and out of time. So every single chapter might span 50 years, 100 years, some chapters span 200 years. And then the next chapter might have some kind of chronological link to the one before it, but often it's more of a thematic conversation. And so the book is a collage in more ways than one. It's a collage of images. So 99% of the book's images are made up of public domain imagery that I accessed from our public archives, like the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian, the National Archives. And then it's a collage of stories and voices and people as well. So I kind of put everything together, which I'll talk about when I read the preface in a second, into this big pot and so they could all sit in conversation with each other in a different way than a normal kind of history textbook. So this is a chapter about communal living at the turn of the century. And this is a chapter about forced segregation and baseball. So you can see every chapter feels very different stylistically, emotionally, tonally, because it's always driven by the imagery and the story itself. And this is a chapter about AIDS activism. And so really the book is kind of this like cacophony of visuals and stories and images that hopefully all come together in the end to give us deeper insight into who we are as a country and who we have the potential to become. So I thought I would start today at the very beginning of the book because it seems like a good place to start. So I'm going to read to you from the preface, and then I'll read you the first chapter as well. So I'm just going to take a sip of water and then I'll dive in. Preface. One of my favorite books when I was younger was a big book called The Wall Chart of World History. It had a musty-colored marbled cover and looked like the kind of thing you'd find in someone's attic steam trunk, the kind of thing that might magically spit you back into the Mesopotamian desert if you weren't careful. The wall chart was a visual timeline that started in 4004 BCE and stacked the histories of people and civilizations from all over the world on top of one another in wavy colored streams. The pages were all connected, folded in on themselves so that you could accordion them out into a giant strip. When the whole thing was unfurled, it was longer than my bedroom. I'd lie on my stomach and follow the streams with my fingers, watching colored bands bloat and shrivel as nations ate each other up or slowly died away. The book, it turns out, was an expanded reproduction of the Adams's synchronological chart of universal history through the eye to the mind, made by Sebastian C. Adams in 1871. Adams was a white Christian missionary whose belief in manifest destiny drove him across the Oregon Trail in the 19th century. His universal chart is very him. It starts with Adam and Eve, celebrates Eurocentric history, and is dominated by white men. Even the cavemen are pale. But it's not just who he chooses to feature that's limited by his own worldview. It's how he chooses to visualize the notion of time itself. In Adams's world, time is a line, a stream that moves in one direction, from the past to the present. A stream might have multiple branches, but all are parallel, rushing along neatly segmented years, forward, never to return. Had Adams delved into histories and philosophies beyond his own, he would have found that many cultures and communities, including many native nations living right next to him in Oregon, didn't conceive of time as a line at all. Instead, time was seen as it was experienced, as a cycle. Day to night to day, spring to summer to fall to winter to spring, generations upon generations of babies to adults to elders and back again. Notions of nonlinear time crop up everywhere, from the Mayans to the Celts, Chinese thought to classical Indian philosophy, African conceptions to DNA traditions. There's a kaleidoscope of philosophies, all with their own interpretations and variations. But one thing that comes up again and again is the belief that time is a continual, ever-evolving relationship, not just a series of isolated fixed points on a line. Native ethnohistorian Donald Fixico writes about Native American conceptions of time and notes that the linear mind looks for cause and effect, while the Indian mind seeks to comprehend relationships. The emphasis is on achieving balance within yourself, your family, your community, broader communities, the environment, not endlessly hurtling away from the past towards some future progress. As a white American brought up on deadlines and timelines and dots and dates, I've been bound to a boat on the river of time, rushing forward for as long as I can remember. I was taught to memorize history when I had to. I was raised to look back on it at a distance. It wasn't until I was well into my 30s that I fell into a relationship with history, and it happened through images. I began searching historical archives for photographs and objects and artifacts I could collage into my art, and they called me in. I found myself wanting to know more about who the people in the portraits were. I wanted to know their stories. It made me wish that I could have explored history more visually when I was younger. A history textbook is so impersonal. The type, the layout, the tone, its design intentionally makes the subject feel distant. I love visual storytelling because the opposite is true. Visual storytelling is a form and a framework that tweaks your brain into seeing differently and reading differently and digesting information differently. It's not just the image that matters, but how it takes up space. It's not just the event that matters, but how we shape the stories around it. This book is nothing like the history textbooks I grew up with. It's visual, it's handwritten, it jumps around in time. It's an attempt at a new way of seeing history, placing movements and events and people from across time in conversation with one another in a way that I hope offers some insight into who we are as a country and who we have the power to become. I've tried to achieve a small ecosystem of balance by including a number of different time periods and people and themes. It's wildly incomplete, the beginning of a beginning. But that's the point. If you, like me, like to learn this way, I hope it gives you just enough to start seeing history around you all the time. In the placement of freeways near your home, in expressions you hear again and again, in the images we use as shorthand for America. Forms change us, and I hope that this book changes you. A poem has the ability to shape us into the truth, just as much as, if not much more so than, a list of facts. I hope you question these stories, this book. I hope your questions turn into creation, of conversation, of art, of action. Because history is now. History is you. History is a relationship that never ends. So that's the preface. And then we move right into the first chapter. And so all of the chapters in the book kind of open on a double spread like this. And each of the titles of the chapters are kind of an American expression, American idiom, like a phrase that you've heard before. So the first chapter is the good old days. And then they each also have a singular kind of little square image, which as I was creating them, I was thinking of as kind of like memory cards, like you play with little memory cards, as these various kind of American iconographic images. And so some are like super, super Americana, like a flag or the Statue of Liberty. Excuse me. And some are more like this. So this is a determined white woman, I will say her expression is, scribbling furiously in a book of history. And they also have kind of a larger, more abstract collage on the other side of the page that gives a hint into what the story is about. And finally, they have a quote. So this quote is about by Mark Twain, and it says, "The very ink with which all history is written is merely fluid prejudice." I can't see you, but I'm going to assume you're all doing okay, and I'm just going to keep forging ahead. Take one more sip of water. At 2 a.m. on the last day of May 2020, flames poured from the headquarters of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Ignited by protesters during the uprisings for racial justice, the blaze was quickly put out, but the message was clear. We know who you are, and we know what you did. The end of the Civil War left white Southerners dejected. Women were widowed and left childless. Others watched as their sons, brothers, fathers, and husbands returned home in defeat. They believed these Confederate men were heroes and wanted to honor their service. So the groups affluent white women had formed during the war to sew uniforms and nurse the wounded grew into associations to care for veterans and commemorate the dead. By the late 1800s, those smaller women's associations began banding together, and in 1894, the United Daughters of the Confederacy was formed. It had been 3 decades since the end of the Civil War, 3 decades since the practice of white people enslaving Black people had been outlawed. In that time, during a period known as Reconstruction, Black people had fought for and won significant gains: U.S. citizenship, due process and equal protection under federal law, the right for Black men to vote, seats in local and national legislatures. White Southerners did not respond well to these gains. They used sustained campaigns of racial terror, Black codes, the Ku Klux Klan, public spectacle lynchings, to ensure that the rights Black people had secured were in name only and could not be exercised fully. It was into this era of renewed, emboldened white power that the United Daughters of the Confederacy was born. A new white Southern generation was coming of age, and it wanted vindication. The war had been lost, but its legacy could still be won. The Daughters weaponized their status as wealthy white women into an army of influence. They wrote letters and raised money and lobbied local officials. They erected monuments to the heroes of the Confederacy, ensuring that Jefferson Davis and Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee towered over as many town halls, courthouses, and public parks as possible. Mamie Garmed Fields, a Black teacher and activist, wrote in her memoirs about how much Black people detested the UDC's monuments, how clearly and viscerally they understood them to be a way of white people telling Black people to stay in their place. When the UDC erected a statue of John C. Calhoun, a politician and slaver who saw slavery as a positive good, in Charleston, South Carolina, Black residents threw rocks at it and defaced it every chance they got. But white women flocked to the UDC's mission and activities. By World War I, UDC membership had ballooned to nearly 100,000, in chapters far beyond the South, from New York to Indiana to California. The daughters didn't stop at physical monuments. They wanted something that would endure generation to generation, so they began crafting a living monument in their children. They raised their children in the culture of the lost cause, where plantation owners were kind caretakers of slaves unequipped to handle freedom. The lost cause depicted slavery as a benevolent institution integral to Southern culture. And to its adherents, the war between the states wasn't about slavery, but cultural differences between the North and the South. The conditioning was joyful. It gave white children pride in their families and in their Southern heritage. Once their own children had been indoctrinated, the daughters moved to indoctrinate other people's children as well, through textbooks. In 1919, Mildred Lewis Rutherford, the Historian General of the UDC, created a measuring rod, a pamphlet that laid out the do's and don'ts of what should be included in children's textbooks. If a book didn't measure up, moms and teachers and librarians were instructed to pull it from the shelves, write "unjust to the South" on the cover, and refuse to teach it. The effort was incredibly successful. The UDC got textbooks banned and teachers fired. Its influence shaped the way generations of children learned about American history well into the 1970s. The 1961 edition of No Alabama, the Alabama State Board-approved history textbook, describes the Ku Klux Klan as the loyal white men of Alabama, and plantation life as one of the happiest ways of life in Alabama before the war between the states. Fourth grade readers are asked to imagine a day in the life on a beautiful plantation where their father is the master and their mother is the mistress. It's a world where, yes, there were slaves, but most of them were treated kindly, and the mistress is the best friend the Negroes have. The chapter is written entirely in the second person. You wake up, you eat, you ride, you play, encouraging children to step into the story and experience delicious meals of fried ham and sweet biscuits, pretty horses, naps in big bedrooms, and lovely parties, all while enslaved people smile and wave in the background. Not only white children were being taught from these textbooks, Black children were as well. Black adults pushed back for over 100 years from the 1870s to the 1970s. Leaders from Frederick Douglass to W.E.B. Du Bois were outspoken on the need to combat a white supremacist telling of history. And Black advocacy groups, from the NAACP to the National Urban League to the Congress of Racial Equality to the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, railed against racist textbooks, urging school boards and cities to change them. It wasn't just in the South. Northern textbooks were less overtly racist and revisionist, but still soaked in white supremacy. History textbooks sympathetic to slavers, geography textbooks celebrating colonialism, biology textbooks reinforcing theories of racial hierarchy. When the NAACP pushed white Northern liberal officials in cities like Albany and Chicago to remove the most hateful passages from local textbooks in the 1940s, officials dismissed their appeals, with some attributing the objections to hypersensitivity. But what Northern whites failed to grasp was that the changes weren't just for the feelings of Black children, they were for the humanity of white children. White children who internalize history as being written by white people, starring white people, for white people. Today, the struggle to control the historical narrative continues. As initiatives like the New York Times' 1619 project reframe America's history by centering the legacy of slavery, opposition is as fierce as ever, with school boards and state legislatures and members of Congress attempting to block its adoption in schools. Some lawmakers are even seeking legislation to remove entire words and concepts from classrooms, such as equity, anti-racism, and oppressor versus oppressed. A single brave person like Bree Newsom can climb a State House flagpole and remove a Confederate flag. But once erected, living monuments are much more difficult to take down. Between 1889 and 1969, 69,706,756 students were enrolled in public schools in the South. Nearly 70 million children holding a history in their hearts and their heads that a group of white women simply made up. So that's the preface in the first chapter. There's 20 more chapters after that, all kind of zooming around in time and looking at different areas of our past. But I'm going to keep barreling ahead so we can get to the Q&A and kind of break down how a spread from that chapter was made. So I have a fairly, I assume, traditional kind of research and writing process. I used the tool Scrivener to write the book, which some of you may know. It's kind of like a fancier word that has like more tools. And the biggest difference is I usually start with the writing and then kind of do the visuals alongside and also afterward. But I start with the research, and as I'm kind of going through and doing like what I call the word research, I'm slowly kind of tentacling across and understanding what images are available. So I'll kind of start to dip into some of the archives. I'll see the type of photography, the types of collections, but I'm really focusing on the story itself and figuring out the arc and the shape of the story I want to tell. And so one of the biggest differences is that there is a few more kind of physical limitations on visual storytelling than regular word writing, because you only have so much space, and the text itself becomes a very physical thing when you're using it in visual storytelling. So for the book, for example, I knew that every chapter had to be an even number of spreads because it always kind of ended on that double page opener. And then I also had a word cap. I couldn't really go above about 160 or 200 words per spread, which is not that many. It's way fewer words than in a kind of standard book. So when I'm writing and figuring it out, first I'm kind of figuring out the shape of the story after I've done all the research, and I'm like, okay, I think I can tell this in maybe five spreads. And then I'm also writing in kind of chunks. So I know that like this chunk of writing will be on this page, this chunk of writing will be on this page. And it's especially important in the book. It's less of an issue when I'm doing like a scroll story, because I want the pages as you open them to be in conversation with each other. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a single image, but the two sides need to relate. And then you can do something totally different when you turn the page. But that also shapes how I'm placing and telling the story. So this is from a spread in the middle of the chapter that I just read. And it's the spread that's talking about this history textbook, No Alabama, which was actually my mom's history textbook in Northern Alabama in the 1960s. So I was talking to her about the story I was trying to tell about the UDC, and she was like, I still have my textbook, like I'll send it to you. So I was like, please do. So she sent it. It's wild. It was even more wild than I expected it to be. And as I'm looking at it and sitting with it and kind of pulling quotes from it from the story, I started thinking about what I wanted it to look like on the page. And so I couldn't just kind of like take a picture of it and plop it in the spread itself, because visually that's a little bit weird to just have like a book in a book, and because it was only part of the story, right? Like I also wanted to show the kids that were learning from the book. I also wasn't entirely clear on the rights for this book, whether I could just cut out the whole thing and put it in. So I was like, well, let me go to the image archives and see what we have in terms of the students themselves. So for the book, I mainly drew from the Library of Congress, Smithsonian Open Access, the National Archives, and the New York Public Library with my 4 big ones. And then I went to tons of other different libraries, depending on where a story was placed. There's a chapter about Sam Adams, so I was obviously doing a bunch of stuff in the Boston Public Library, but the Library of Congress was like one of my big dudes that I went back to again and again. So I went to the Library of Congress and I started doing all these image searches to kind of look at classrooms, specifically classrooms in the South, around from like the 1920s to the 1970s, which was like the time period where the UDC's influence in terms of textbooks was the greatest. So I'm going through, and my first stop would be that I'm kind of scrolling through everything, and then I would create private Pinterest boards to save the images, because I realized very quickly that I needed breadcrumbs back to find the link, so I didn't like lose them in the morass of the internet. So I'm creating all these boards, and then I'm starting to look at the images, and I'm like, what do I want the tone and the feeling of the spread to be like? What kind of children do I want to see? What do I want them doing? Do I want a single face? Do I not want to see their face? Do I just want the classroom? Do I want the outside of the building? So I'm going through all of them. So as I'm going through, I found this image. And I was like, oh, this is great. There's lots of elements. Like, I love how you can see the kids' eyes. I love how I see a book that's open. There's a classroom. Their clothing feels very time specific. Like, it kind of brought me into the era of what I'm talking about. So I was like, I'll play with this one. So I did all what I called the base spreads, kind of the things in Photoshop. So I have my Photoshop file all laid out with all my margins and the correct sizing and stuff. So I grab this image, I drag it in, and it opens up like this. And I'm like, whoa, hello, how are you doing there? You're huge. And it opened up super large because it was a really high res image. So it was like 600 DPI or some other blessedly beautiful large thing that some unnamed digital archivist that I'm in love with uploaded for me. And so as I brought him in, I was like, oh, so much hits, right? Like I loved the way he was both really rapt and paying attention, but also looks vacant in this way, like just very passively absorbing the information. I loved that you could kind of see that book on the table. I loved that you got a sense of kind of time period from the look of the photo. And I also loved this big field of open space. And that's something that I think about a lot with visual storytelling, is you're always trying to understand how the text is going to fit in, because you need a fair amount of space for the text. So sometimes, depending on imagery, I could create those spaces either by kind of layering other blank pieces of paper or kind of other kind of artifacts. But in this situation, I was like, perfect. I have this big, gorgeous field. I have him. I love it. So I put him there. I dragged another student in and put her on the side. And then I went back to the textbook and pulled out just a piece, like just enough to give you a hint, and like plopped it right in their brains. And then I floated in the text that I had done, that I'd already written. And so the first pass, when I floated in, I only had it kind of handwritten and I had the other parts in quotes. And as I was looking at it, I was like, you're still not getting enough of the physicalness of that textbook, right? The fact that like this was a physical object that like tens of thousands of children were holding and reading. And so I was like, well, what if we just cut out those passages from the textbook digitally, not physically? I did not destroy any artifacts or textbooks. And so I did that. I physically cut out the words they would have seen, so you can see it in the exact type in that, to make it more of a physical thing. And that ended up as this spread. So from this, when I'm kind of writing it traditionally, to this, just one example of what a spread was like. Okay. Ask me anything. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ariel. Seeing your process is super interesting. And yeah, like I said in the intro, this book is so good. It's just like so beautifully done, and it like just like really grabs you. So I hope everyone in the audience is like ordering the book as we speak right now. If anyone has questions, please, yeah, drop them in the Q&A. We'll get to those. I think to start out, I would just love to kind of talk a little bit more about this like nonlinear time. I think one of the things that I loved so much about the book was the fact that it was not chronological, which sort of keeps you on your toes. Like you go from a chapter on the AIDS crisis and ACT UP activism, and then you're into like revolutionary America media. And so it's like, it's really like making these connections that are kind of surprising. And I'm sure other people feel this way, but the last few years, like I feel it like viscerally in my bones, this idea of like a non-linear time, like time no longer makes sense. Everything is connected. So I just would love to dive into that a little bit in terms of like, how did you decide what to talk about, how to make those connections? Because one of the things that I loved so much was that, you're pulling out all these really interesting bits of American history, but you're also either, implicitly or explicitly connecting it to things that are happening currently, which is just super interesting. So how did you land on that? How did you decide to do it that way?
Why? Thank you for all of that. And you say that, and I'm like, yes, you see the book so clearly. It's funny because you're the first person. So I sold this book the first week of the pandemic, like the week that I was having my conversations with editors and publishers and stuff. It was the first week everyone was home and everyone was like, what is happening? And I finished it last fall, right? And so I think that you're the first person that's made the connection between the time of the pandemic, like that, like weird wash and this, which is funny. I actually hadn't thought about it so much in that. But for me, the nonlinear part was always really important because I think I'm someone who came to loving history really late in life. Like it was something that I hated history when I was a kid. I never connected with it. It was like not my subject. And I like really loved school. I loved everything, but history was always the thing that was just not my jam. And when I did finally connect with it, a lot of it was because it was when I started to see how present it was. And so that was something that was always, I think when I went back and was finding myself really drawn to better understanding these stories, that was something I always wanted. Like I wanted to see how it all came together. And I think that that was the thing with history that was always missing the most for me as well, is that it was always taught to me in these kind of discrete little chunks. And for me, the way you live, generally, everything is flowing together, right? Like they're not separated out like that. And so I wanted to kind of create a framework that would allow me to swim in it in that way. And in terms of how, so funnily, like the nonlinear part was something that I knew before I knew anything else, before I had even locked the exact stories or the order of the stories. I knew that I wanted to be constantly weaving back and forth through time. So that was always very much like the general framework of the book. And in terms of the stories, like, so I both approached it kind of, I think emotionally in some ways, and then also like very structured. Like in the very, very beginning, I had this whole frameworks document where I had kind of ideas about various attributes, like kind of Americans, like kind of like who we are. And like each one of those was framing a chapter. And then that became more of like the idioms that I used. But I knew I wanted to include lots of different voices, stories about lots of different types of things. So I wanted something about art, and I wanted something about labor, and I wanted something about healthcare. And then thematically, where I found the point. So for a long time, I had the stories. Most of them were set almost from the proposal stage. But I was moving around the order for like ever. So like I had all these index cards like in my kitchen and on my floor, and I would like switch them around. And the first thing that kind of came into view was the beginning and the end. Like I knew like the UDC one made a lot of sense, because I was like, okay, I think it's really good to start with this point of like how history is formed and crafted intentionally. And then the ending one is all about mutual aid and collective action. And like that was very important to me as like a hopeful point of ending the book. But in between, sometimes the thematic links made a lot of sense. So like the end, for example, so the chapter that comes after the one I just read is about abolition. And so like that made a lot of sense to me. Like I always wanted to make sure if you had this like sphere of history you were turning around in your hands as you read, you were kind of going to another side that both deepened your understanding of the story that came before and kind of led you into the next one. But sometimes like with the AIDS activism chapter that you mentioned, and then going into Sam Adams, it was almost more of like a feeling. Like I think when you think about ACT UP and their graphics and like the 80s and 90s and that sense of just like media kind of overload of completely transforming how people were emotionally relating to like a huge movement, that to me tonally sat right next to Sam Adams, when I could kind of beginning to think about him like going into pubs and having these broadsheets and like railing against the British, and like somehow that like felt like the same thing to me. So I think sometimes it's a little less clear and sometimes more so, but yeah, I just wanted to throw it all in one pot and like shake it up and see what happened.
I love that. And I think you're 100% right. Like when I first flipped the page, I was like, wait, where am I? When am I? But then it totally clicked. I was like, yes, media, of course. Like, yes, this makes total sense. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that like you're tackling like so much history and so many like really big topics, but you do it in a way that's like very digestible, like very engaging. But one thing that really struck me is that so many of these chapters, like you're talking about these big issues, but you're like focusing it too, like using like an individual person to like help tell a bigger story. Like I'm thinking in particular about like the farm workers unionizing and striking, and using the Filipino activist in particular to kind of tell that bigger story. So how did you find some of those stories though, to like really put a human aspect on some of these like really big issues?
So again, I think how I kind of find stories is always very serendipitous in a lot of ways. I think that I'm like swimming in lots of people that I follow and listen to, or reading books, and like I find something that sparks my interest and then I want to know more. And then sometimes it's also, I had heard about the Delano grape strike for a long time. I like kind of knew what it was about, but it was nothing that I'd ever focused on. And then even when I started reading more about it, like so much was centered around, Cesar Chavez and like Dolores Huerta. And then I kind of got these little bits that were coming in a little bit more about some of the Filipino farm workers. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting side of the story, that was not the side that was ever presented to me, and seeing how that kind of the interplay between the Filipino and Mexican farm workers shaped so much of how that developed. And so there's kind of all these, it's like seeing this story and then the parts that kind of turn me into being like, oh, that captures my interest. Like I kind of want to see how that goes is often how I frame it. And sometimes it's about narrative building, like how can I only have, again, like 1,000 words, 1,200 words max to tell this story, so like what can I kind of hang it around that it will make sense in such a short time frame. And then others are about availability of images, especially for this book. So like again, the ACT UP chapter, when I was writing it, there's a wealth of images I can go in and there's just like so many that I can use. And sometimes there's almost no public available imagery. So like with ACT UP, a lot of the imagery was not public domain because it's very recent. But then I found, for example, the Storm the NIH protests that I did it against, that kind of shaped the chapter around, was because they were protesting a governmental agency. And so we had that in our archives. And so I could do it that way. So sometimes it was kind of like forced on me, and then other times I would like try to find the route to it. But
well, and someone in the Q&A asked, can you give us a taste of another topic or two? So wondering if any of the chapters like particularly have your heart more than any of the others.
My heart, I don't know. Let's see. Let's open up the book. I have the book right here. Let's see what else we have.
I mean, there's so many good topics in here. There are so many. You're moving around from like forced sterilization, women's rights, indigenous act. I mean, it's so good.
It's really all over the place. And so, there's the chapter that was actually the proposal for the book that I sold the book on was about gun culture. And so about Sam Colt and kind of like the making of how he kind of branded the revolver and firearms generally, and how that kind of changed how we think about gun culture, created modern gun culture. There's, I think that, I don't even know. I mean, I could list what they're about, but there's like, I relate to all of them in such different ways.
Maybe we could talk about Niagara Falls a little bit.
Sure, I will go to Niagara Falls.
That one really piqued my interest because I had no idea about the toxic waste in Niagara Falls. I'm not sure how much of our audience knows, but I think, you touch on it a little bit, like Niagara Falls really started to pivot as this like tourism destination. And I think a lot of what people know Niagara Falls for is tourism. And, as historic preservationists, that's a big part of that too. But, you tell this story about Niagara Falls being basically a toxic waste dump. So could you talk a little bit more about that? And especially like you living in Buffalo, like Niagara Falls is not very far away from where you are.
I'm living in Buffalo. So I've lived in Buffalo for about a decade. I'm not from Buffalo. And I actually had not heard about Love Canal growing up either, because it was kind of happened like in the late 70s. I was born in the early 80s. So I like had just missed it. And so when I similarly first heard the story, because here it's much more, people talk about it. People were there. People have family members that were working at a lot of these chemical plants and stuff. And I was like, what? Like, and we go to the falls all the time. It's 20 minutes away. And so the chapter that Katie is referring to is this one, which is called Made in America. And it kind of follows the toxic legacy of the falls and how it went. I'm just going to show pictures as I do this. So it kind of opens up by saying, if you kind of scroll over Niagara Falls, you see all these landscapes and they like don't quite look right. And they're all basically toxic waste dumps. And it goes back to the beginning of when, different people came to the falls in the kind of late 18th century and started kind of opening up all of this huge industry and using the power of the falls to like run and power their mills. And because there was so much energy, it became like the greatest hydroelectric enterprise in the world at a certain point. And because they had so much energy, they were able to do, it attracted a lot of chemical companies that needed like a ton of power to process their stuff. And so it kind of goes into like the 40s and 50s. And as these companies are manufacturing what we thought of the time as these like magical products, right? Like it was like our medicines and our homes and our like the way that we like pressed our shirts. So much waste was produced, and they just kind of threw it wherever they could, and then how that ended up bubbling up in the 60s and 70s. But like every chapter, it's always both about, you know, these wildly difficult things that are happening, and then the people that are coming together to kind of push back against it. So it goes into the local activists who fought back, and then the formation of the EPA, but then how these things come up again and again and again, and how even when you remove the toxins from the ground, even with the EPA, when you're cleaning up a site, like that still has to go somewhere. Like it doesn't just disappear. So where does that go and how does that work? And so that's the arc of that chapter.
Yeah, all news to me, embarrassingly, but I think
It's saying you can't know everything,
one of the
right?
reasons like this book is so great is like you say in the prologue, this is not like normal history textbooks. Like so much of our history is like woefully inadequate in terms of like what we learn in school. And so I think part of what's exciting about history to me as an adult is like, oh, I get to keep learning. I get to keep like figuring out what's actually going on. And so finding things like this to help bring that to light is always really nice. And I did want to ask about Buffalo, like knowing you're not a native Buffalonian, but the reason I found you originally was because of the City Lab article you wrote about researching where you are. Basically, it was like I think you published it very early pandemic, like how to time travel when you're stuck at home. And so I found that and I was like, who is this person? This is amazing. And then you very graciously answered my cold email. But I want to touch on you living in Buffalo and how that has like impacted your work or your relationship to history, or I mean, take that however you want it, but I feel like it must in some way has like seeped into your consciousness.
Oh, it does. And like, so I love it here. Like I'm a huge Buffalo convert. So when I moved here, I had never set foot in this city before in my life. Now we've been here for a decade. We're raising our kids here, like big fan of Buffalo. And I think any place that you are sinks into you, right? Like, and because again, I don't have like a traditional emotional relationship with history. Like I think I'm the kind of person that is very affected by landscape and built environment. And like when you see certain things around you all the time, like they affect how you move and how you feel about where you are. And so I think that is kind of always there. And Buffalo is an older city, so I'm very fascinated with like different types of houses and like what that means and why they were built and different types of buildings. And I always find that to be a really wonderful way to explore history and periods of history I have a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old. So like, I find that to be a really accessible way to talk about those things with them. Like, why do you think we put this road here? And like, why do you think this is totally empty? And like, this building looks like this. Why do we think it was built in this way? Like what might have been the use for this building and whatever else. But from a different, more practical way, Buffalo was actually kind of this funny, linchpin for me about how I got into writing the types of stories that I do now. Because when I moved here, I was kind of like playing around with some visual storytelling stuff, but it was very poetic. Like it was very random. It was not at all like nonfiction stuff. And when I first moved here, I was playing around with a startup that was trying to figure out how to do, it was like the people who had made like TypePad, like way back in the blogging days. And they were trying to figure out how to make magazines for like iPhones, but for individual creators. And it never went anywhere, but we were toying around with this idea of doing like a Buffalo magazine kind of. So I started writing these little visual stories that were kind of first person, but about me getting to know the city, but then exploring its history through me exploring the city. So like I wrote one that was about finding out the history of the house we were renting actually before this house. And I ended up finding the grandson of like the dude who's built its business partner. And we like had spaghetti together and he told me how we like had this whole thing. But I always found it this great kind of way to weave through time, like as you're weaving through the present, and gave me such a deeper love for the place that I was, right? Like when you can see it across time and not just where you are now. So I think Buffalo did have a big influence on me, even though I don't think about it that way all the time. But
That's amazing. I love that. And I feel like that is like quintessentially like what preservationists are about to like kind of figuring out like how do we view these physical manifestations of our history and then like steward them into the future, because this isn't like as you say in your book, it's like history is happening all the time. We are part of history. Everything we do is, kind of feeding into that narrative. So kind of stopping to embrace that a little bit. We had a question from the audience, specifically wondering about, well, first she says, I loved your public library work, which, same. But since you're in Buffalo, have you considered doing anything about 514, which was the Cops Jefferson Avenue massacre in Buffalo?
So I have, I mean, that's obviously huge for us here. And I have done stuff in a slightly different way. I think I'm very conscious and careful about where my place in that story is. But one thing that I've done is that I do a lot of work here with a grassroots kind of political group. And we recently, our Common Council has elections next month. And so we did a series of billboards and bus shelter ads around the city that I had designed recently that was basically all about injustices. Some of them directly tied to that, about segregation and especially about food access and stuff. But I think that where I see my role in things like that and kind of in all issues is how you can bring these truths to people where they are in a way that they're not used to encountering them. So I think that this book is one example of that, in history in a new way, where you're kind of like, wait, I've never seen it like this. And I think for me, something like bus shelters is that there's so many awful, brutal truths that led to 514 like being possible, right? And I think that often they're known, but when they're talked about, it's like in a 64-page white paper on like, segregation or whatever, and less just like on the street where you encounter them in that kind of way. And so I think that I'm often working with people to try to figure out how to do that storytelling work in lots of different ways. So we try it, on social media, we try it on billboards, we try it in forums like this where we're talking about it. But that's where I kind of see my role with that. But there's some incredible projects. I know the son of one of the victims just published a book that I think is coming out this week, actually, called 514. I know that I attended this incredible art exhibition on the anniversary that was done by high school students, where they did collective portraits of each of the victims, where they kind of went in and chose the photography together, and then each of them worked on crafting these portraits that were really beautiful. And so I think there's lots of people doing incredible work around it. But yes, Mark Talley.
And we had another question, kind of generally, what are you working on? What's next for you?
Am I working on? Good question. So it's a really funny point. It's so funny because like I've heard, this is the first time I've ever written a book. And so like I always hear authors in these things, and like I think that until you do it, like you don't realize how long ago I finished the book, but then how much I'm still involved with it. So like at present, there's still like a lot of marketing stuff with the book, and so a lot of event stuff. I've been doing a lot of workshops with kids around the book, which has been like really, really fun. So different kind of collage stuff and history stuff with young people, which is great. I did a proposal for a children's book, which I'm kind of doing, which for a second I thought I wanted to like give my brain a break and do something completely different. But now it's been long enough that I'm like, no, I'm ready for my next big project. So I've been doing a lot of like freelance stuff. I've been kind of like taking a moment to breathe to make sure that my next thing is what I want. And I think that when I was doing this book, I had a lot of ideas about what I wanted the next one to do, and they were very much within this universe. So other kind of historical things, like structured in a very similar way. And I wanted to make sure that I took enough of a breather so that as I start to do the next thing, which I'm pretty sure I know what I want it to be, it is big enough. Like I'm not like hemming myself in. So I don't have anything super concrete, except for kind of smaller stuff, but yeah.
Great. Any more City Lab things we should look out for? Because I feel like so many, there were at least a few that like appeared in the book that people can find on the internet, which I can drop in the chat too. And any of those that you feel like people should be like, definitely go look at, and like, if you want to know what I'm about, like these are the articles that you should go see.
Out of anything I've ever done?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, City Lab was like my home, right? Like I think City Lab is like where I became like to do the work that I do. I think the most recent one about libraries is a great place to start, honestly, because I think it kind of talks about a lot of different stuff. I also think the one that you mentioned about exploring your neighborhood from your home, like the time travel one, is really fun for people too. I've had more people I feel like that also happened during the pandemic, like in the beginning, where it's in my memory, I don't know like where it went, like it was such a different type of story. But I think I know a lot of people that actually did it, like they went through and then actually like went and found, and I was like, yes, that's awesome. um
Yes, it was very thorough for anybody out there who is like thinking about like, what's the history of my house? What's the history of my block? There you go. You have you have it at your fingertips. Um, yeah, and then I I wanted to talk a little bit before we wrap up about visual storytelling, kind of more generally, because I think it's such a great medium for like engaging people who are not necessarily like going to sit down and read a history book, which like I will do that, but like not everybody, that's not what people want to do all the time. And I know you mentioned Lauren Redness, I think in the acknowledgements, who is like amazing. And we read her book Oak Flat in this Preservation League book club a while back. And amazing, like Lauren Redness is amazing. But are there other folks who are working in this medium that you would recommend people check out?
So many. Yes, this is like my favorite question because I love their work more than my work. So Lauren Redness, definitely the book Radioactive, which I mentioned in the acknowledgements, and like changed my life. Like that, it's a book that just like I read and blew my mind open about what a visual book could look like. So Lauren Redness is wonderful. Mira Jacob, who's almost more on the kind of comic side, but she wrote a book called Good Talk, which I think is a really, really beautiful exploration. It's about her son and about race in America. Really funny, and like she's just an incredible writer, and I think she uses visuals in a very interesting, different way than I do. Nora Krug is a German American writer who wrote a book called Belonging that kind of explored German American identity, and she uses a lot of mixed media stuff, so her style is very different and cleaner than mine. Like she also started as a comic artist, but I thought it was a really interesting use of personal historical artifacts to kind of tell a story. Who else can I think of? Myra Kalman does beautiful work. So she does picture books, which are incredible. And she also, I first came across her work when the New York Times about like 10, 12 years ago was doing a lot more kind of like visual op-eds in different ways. And so she started doing these different visual essays. So she wrote, what is it called? I'm going to forget the name now, but she has a few books that are Perfect Union. I'm going to forget the names, but she does beautiful stuff, more painterly, but also kind of visual storytelling. Who else am I thinking of? Leanne Shapton is another really, really cool artist who does much more, less kind of like nonfiction stuff and more kind of sketchbook journalistic types of things. Yeah, but all sorts. I could go on and on. I love it all. And I love the gamut from like more graphic design stuff to more visual stuff. But I think those are the main ones I'd hit.
No, that's great. And for those in the audience, I will put together a recap of this program, and I'll put some of these resources in a blog post. You'll be able to find the recording on our website, as well as some of the things that we've talked about here. So you'll be able to find that within the next few days or so.
Awesome.
Oh, and Lorna Peterson in the chat did recommend the work on single room occupancy, which like, yes, hard agree. I thought that was so good. And speaking to a preservation audience, I think that one is definitely something to check out. And like, as far as like issues of like housing crisis and unequal access to housing. And then in that chapter too, you talk about community land trust, which is also like such an interesting tool that is not always used by preservationists, but like there is some synergy there. So I think that's something that, people could definitely look into. I thought that was so good.
Awesome. I love that. Woohoo, book ordered, yay. It's a great one. And it's also interesting because it's one of the ones that existed as an article and then came into a different iteration in the book. And so I think it's also interesting, if you're really into visual storytelling, to kind of read that, and you'll see stylistically how different it is. And so there's parts that are very similar and there's parts that are totally different, and the ending kind of goes in a different way in the book. But thank you for recommending that. And the other thing I was going to say before, when you were talking about resources, if anyone is interested, I also have a running list of links to archives, so like public domain images and stuff. So I'm happy to share that with you if you wanted to include some of that. But that's always like, that was such an entry point for me. So I think that people often are really surprised. I mean, maybe less this audience, but like what's available and what you can go through, and it's just more and more all the time. So yeah, I can share that with you as well if you're interested.
Yes, absolutely. I can include some of those links in the recap as well. And yeah, there's amazing stuff out there if you if you know where to look for Creative Commons
It's
stuff.
wild,
And
right? Like,
yeah, you can get some like amazing art for your home. Just like go to Creative Commons, like download this
print a
high-res
Van
file and get
Gogh.
it printed, it's great. But this was so wonderful. Thank you so much again for responding to my cold email when I was like, hello, you don't know me, but I would like to talk to you.
I was so there. I was so excited. No, this is fantastic. This is fascinating. Thank you so much. I'm not typing in the chat because I'm trying to pay attention, but I'm seeing everything everyone's writing, and I appreciate you. This is lovely. This is so wonderful. Thank you so much for finding the book and reaching out, and this is awesome.
I loved it. I will recommend it so aggressively, in the nicest way possible. But yes, thank you, Ariel, for your work and for joining us. And thank you all for tuning in. These are always so fun, and I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. And as I mentioned, you will find a recap on our website, and the recording of this webinar will be up even sooner than that. So if you loved it, and I hope you did, I hope you send it to all your friends and tell them that they need to watch it and order the book as soon as possible, because it's just so great. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for making time for this. I really appreciate it.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.